Welcome to All Pro Football Data. My name is Jim Coburn, and today's episode we're talking about the Jacksonville Jaguars 2024 NFL Draft Class based on data. So we're going to be looking at production, athleticism, and other statistical factors to determine how well the Jaguars did in this particular draft class. Now, there's a couple different things you need to know before I grade the class. One is draft pick approximate value. Draft pick approximate value is essentially the average approximate value for a selection depending on the range of possibilities that they were at. So, in other words, it's like the expectation. When you take a player at pick 1 through 5, the vast majority of players picked from 1 through 5 end up becoming 98 percentile NFL players. So, if that prospect doesn't become a 98 percentile player, you picked the wrong prospect. So that is what draft pick approximate value is, and it's a good way to kind of judge how well a draft pick did in many ways long term based on that formula, or I wouldn't even say formula, based on what Pro Football Reference uses in terms of their data. But also on top of that, what do I compare it to? Well, I compare the expectation to the data grade. And if you want to learn more about data grades, you can check out my top 50 prospects video that's on this channel. But essentially, what a data grade is, or what the EAV is, which is expected approximate value, it is sort of like a ceiling grade. So it takes a look at a player based on their production, their athleticism, their strength of schedule, strength of team, their age, every single statistical factor that you could think of that's relevant to their position, that's correlative to their position, is used to make their data grade. And based on the work that I've done, just a little snippet, I don't want to go into too much detail because it could take up the whole video, but 70 or higher is typically the data grade that you want to get to. About 86% of long-term starting NFL players typically had a 70 or better data grade at the position. So if a prospect scores higher than that, they're in good company. If a prospect scores lower than that, they're a little bit more of a risky prospect from a probability standpoint. And that's what we're talking about ultimately. We're talking about probability. Probability is not certainty. There's going to be some prospects that don't test the best or don't do the best in terms of my data that end up becoming long-term starters, but there are far fewer of those types of guys compared to the guys that actually have data, good data grades. So with all that stuff out, let's take a look at some limiting factors. So these are the things that kind of can affect the data, things that can make it less effective. And these are pretty much most of the arguments that people make when they discount data. So some of the things that can affect it are injuries. They could be the coaching of a team can affect a player's data grade. So they might have had a bad grade or a very good grade, but they go to the wrong team and then nothing really happens with them. Psychological and mental makeup is another big factor. But all of these factors are things that can limit the data in some ways to make it less effective. And I just let you guys know that ahead of time to kind of show that, okay, it's not perfect. Like you could have a player test really well data wise, but they have these things that happen to them and they don't quite make their potential. So that's just something to remember as we get into the data grades. Then, of course, in terms of needs, so this is a general needs assessment of the Jacksonville Jaguars. This is all the prospects that the Jaguars had on their team before the draft and how they performed thus far based on their overall data grades. So this is how they actually have performed as well. NFL positional value is how they actually performed, and then the data grade is how they came out of college testing as a prospect. So you can kind of see, the strengths and weaknesses of their team from a data perspective. But this is kind of what we're working with here. And based on this, the biggest needs on offense seem to be running back, wide receiver, tight end. And then, of course, when you get to the defensive side of the football, defensive tackle, cornerback, and safety, those seem to be the biggest needs for the Jaguars. So when I do my overall final grade of the Jaguars, I'm going to be looking at did they fill their biggest needs? Running back, tight end, wide receiver, defensive tackle, safety, cornerback. Did they draft prospects that can fill those needs? But secondly, did they draft good data prospects, at least based on my definition of it? Did they draft prospects that have 70 or higher data grades? Because those players typically become better long term when they have 70 or higher data grades. And then, of course, we have did they draft prospects that outperform their draft status? So consistently, this happens every year, but you'll see teams that draft players in the 7th, in the 6th, in the 5th, in the 4th round that have non-existent data grades, 30 to 40 percentile data grades. And those players have virtually little to no success at the next level. So again, if you're going to be drafting a player later, take prospects that have the potential to outperform their draft status, and you'll do a lot better in the draft. They may not hit 100%, but if they do hit, a lot of times they just you end up having a much better draft class when you take players in the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th round that end up becoming long-term starters. It just is what it is when it comes to that. Then, of course, we get to pick 23. So starting with the first pick for the Jaguars in this particular draft class, they take Brian Thomas Jr., wide receiver out of LSU. Not a bad start. 96.81 in terms of his data grade, 79.75 in terms of his floor, and his balance grade is 88.28 out of 100. Overall pick AV would be 93.05, and overall pick grade would be a B plus. I'll probably give it an A in many ways. Now, when you look at offensive market share scores for him, he didn't have the best market share production. 63 percentile in terms of receiving and 63 percentile in terms of total offensive market share. But he did have a really good touchdown market share score of 78 percentile. So he's somebody who did really well in terms of getting touchdowns for LSU. Then, of course, when you get to efficiency scores, this is the area where he did really well too. Great in terms of his TD percentage. He was 90 plus percentile in terms of that. So consistently, when you gave Brian Thomas Jr. the football, he was getting in the end zone. So that's a great number for him to have. And in terms of yards per reception, very good in terms of that number as well. So this is a good all-around efficiency. So not only was his touchdown market share really good, but he also had great efficiency scores, which can make you feel a little less iffy about his market share data because even though he wasn't utilized as much as you'd like him to be utilized, he still has the efficiency scores indicative of a really great player. Then, of course, you get to athleticism traits. Based on this, he had an 85 percentile explosion score with a 96 percentile speed score. These are exactly the types of numbers that you want in terms of wide receiver prospect. And he has more athleticism than he really needs at the position, but these are great traits for him to have. And then, of course, in terms of adjusted production, this takes a look at his age, his level of competition, his strength of team. And based on these numbers, fantastic in terms of his adjusted production, in terms of age, MSA rating, pass rating. Every single adjusted production trait you could look at was fantastic and gives him all pro to Pro Bowl potential. So he was probably their best pick. He was their first pick and great all-around player in many ways. Then, of course, you get to pick 48 in Mason Smith, defense tech out of LSU. They drafted a lot of players from LSU, by the way. His data grade is 63.56. His floor is 57.54. His balance grade is 60.55 with a pick AV of 85.71. So the average AV of prospects taken at 48 is 85.71. I would give this grade, this overall pick, a D. When you take a look at his market share production, non-existent production in many ways in terms of solo tackle and tackle for loss data. When you take a look at his other market share scores, the only thing he did well in was pass deflection data, but his forced fumble and interception data at the defensive tackle position was really non-existent. When you take a look at athleticism traits, he did have above average athleticism, which is a positive. 68 percentile explosion was his best trait in that particular area. But when you look at adjusted production, his pass score is very low. His MSA rating is okay. He does have a good age score. So, again, he's more of a D prospect. He has the age to develop into something interesting. But again, he's not an elite level athlete. His production wasn't really that great either. So he is a lot more of a risky prospect when you're talking about taking a guy at pick 48. So from a data perspective, this was not the best pick. Then, of course, you get to pick 96 and Jerry Jones, cornerback out of Florida State. His data grade was 58.07. His projected floor is 41.6. His balance grade is 49, and his pick AV is 61.78. Overall pick grade would be a F. Main reason why is production traits. He has a great interception score, but his solo tackle data is non-existent, and his pass deflection data is non-existent at the cornerback position. Then when he gets to athleticism traits, he does have good athleticism. He had 83 percentile explosion and 84 percentile speed. So he is a good athlete, but when you look at that flexibility score, not the best, 45 percentile. So that's the change of direction athleticism score, and this is not what you want a cornerback to have. So in other words, he's fast, He's explosive and doesn't have very good change of direction skills. And I'm sorry, that's not something that you want at the cornerback position. That would make him a liability in coverage. Then, of course, you get to adjusted production traits where he wasn't the most impressive, 60 percentile overall in terms of that, with a below average age score. This is just not that great of a pick for the Jaguars and was realistically kind of a dud. I mean, now if he becomes a starter, great. If he becomes an outlier, great. But again, he would have to become an outlier to become a really successful player at the next level. Then, of course, we get to pick 114 and Javon Foster, offensive tackle out of Missouri. When you take a look at his data grade, he had a 76.91 score. His floor is 58.45. His balance grade is 67.68 with a pick AV of 49.03 out of 100. I would give this overall pick a C. Taking a look at his athleticism traits, he had great explosion traits in the Pro Bowl averages, in fact, in terms of his explosive lower body strength score, but his speed and flexibility are below average. Now, he does have the length to get away with this, so this is something where maybe his physical metrics, his size, his length, could kind of help him out a little bit here, but he does have some liability issues here in terms of speed and flexibility. So we'll see what happens with him. Some people kind of graded him out as sort of a long-term starting zone blocking tackle. That could still be the case, but he definitely is somebody who might need to hold a lot more because of his issues athletically. Then, of course, we get to pick 116 and Jordan Jefferson, defensive tackle out of LSU. Based on his data grade, he had a 67.55 data grade, 54.61 in terms of floor, and 61.08 in terms of his balanced grade. His pick AV is 55.21 out of 100 with an overall pick grade of a D. Again, another LSU player who didn't really test as well as he needed to really do well in this system. So he was a little bit more productive than Mason Smith. A good tackle for loss data, above average sack data with below average solo tackle data. Did a little bit better in terms of pass deflections and interceptions, which is a good thing. And athletically speaking, he was a much better athlete. 81 percentile explosion and 73 percentile speed with not much to go on in terms of flexibility for his size. And then based on his adjusted production, he was a little bit better, maybe around the same sort of area as Mason Smith, but his age, his MSA rating, and pass rating are not exactly where you want them to be 100%. So he's kind of like an older prospect, but he does have better athleticism. Overall, he's kind of a fringe starter slash backup type of player, and that's not the best value when you're talking about picking later in the round, where you could have got somebody who could have become a starter. Next up, we got pick 153 and DeAndre Prince, cornerback out of Ole Miss. Based on his data grade, he had a 40.36 percentile data grade. Floor is 39, balance grade is 39.91, and his pick AV is 37.45. Overall pick grade over here would be a F. Taking a look at his production traits, he had above average pass deflection data with average solo tackle and below average interception data. When you look at his athleticism traits, 71 percentile in terms of speed with a 25 percentile explosion score, not where you kind of want him to hit in terms of that. And then when you get to adjusted production traits, his pass score is not really that impressive, and his age is very low. So most likely for Prince, there are some positives here. He could become a long-term starter based on his production traits. There are some things there that are interesting, but based on his age and based on his other sort of factors, he's probably going to be a non-factor long term. I mean, I could be wrong, but that just is kind of how his data shows him out to be. Then, of course, you get to pick 167 and Keelan Robinson, running back out of Texas. His data grade is 66.36. His floor is 41. His balance grade is 54. And pick AV is 37.07. Overall pick grade would be a D. When you take a look at his production traits, he had above average receiving market share, but that's about it. Below average in everything else. His other efficiency scores are really good, though. His yards per touch, his yards per reception, his TD percentage were all very good, but he also had very, very low volume in the Texans offense. So a lot of times you'll have guys that have great efficiency, but they also had low volume. So you don't really know what his true efficiency is because of how little he was used, which is kind of a concern here. And then, of course, you get to his athleticism traits, 72 percentile in terms of speed, with below average explosiveness and flexibility for his size. And then when you get to adjusted production traits, he hits the starter averages in a way, but I think overall he's more of a backup rotational guy. So he does have some good traits in terms of athleticism. He did have above average receiving market share, but I would kind of see him more as a backup rotational guy in many ways based on his overall profile. Then, of course, we get to pick 212 and Cam Little, kicker out of Arkansas. Based on the average AV of kickers taken at this pick, he scored a 40.01. The floor is 40, and the balance grade is 40, with the pick AV being 35.91. I would give this pick a F. Kickers just do not have the AV to warrant a selection to be drafted. They really don't. I mean, I understand that a lot of people, want a kicker. They think, oh, he's going to be the best kicker and all that kind of stuff. But for the most part, based on history, kickers just do not have the best approximate value long term. Even the best kicker ever is really not worth as much as a starting running back or a starting position of different values. So, again, I understand there's been some good kickers here and there, but I just don't like this pick because of the value here. Then, of course, we get to the last pick of the draft for the Jacksonville Jaguars and Miles Cole, edge from Texas Tech. His data grade is 39.98. His floor is 25.85. Balanced grade is 32.92 with a pick AV of 22.39 out of 100. The overall pick grade would be a F. Taking a look at his production traits, he had below average production. His edge rusher market share was below average. His athleticism was very good, but when you look at his adjusted production, he's kind of non-existent there. Overall, I would give the final grade for the Jacksonville Jaguars a F. Did they get some roster needs? Yes. Did they draft good prospects? Mostly no. Did they draft prospects that had the data potential to outperform their draft status? I would say no. The Jaguars are in contention for the worst draft of this class. It's not that they didn't take some good prospects, but the bulk of the draft was filled with below average to average data prospects. And because of that, I have to give them an F. They did start out well. I do like Brian Thomas Jr. There's a couple other prospects in here that are decent, but overall, I would not grade them that highly based on the system that I use. But let me know in the comment section below, what do you feel about the Jacksonville Jaguars class? Also, check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/jcoburn. Check out my Twitter, also, is now on X now, called at Geometrics. And also check out my 2024 NFL Draft Analytics Guide, available today. Link is in the description for that. And I'll see you guys in the next episode. Peace.